The real prison won't begin until you're in the gulag. Andrzej Poczobut, held by the Belarusian regime in a prison in Grodno, heard these words from a long-term inmate. But he didn't believe them. He'd already been through the interrogations, the detentions, months of solitary confinement, and had spent time on the feared special wing alongside prisoners on death row. He thought he'd seen everything, but later on he would understand that in Belarus, the prison system doesn't exist just to keep people behind bars. Its true function is making sure you toe the line. This doesn't always involve violence and torture. It's about the system. The system which gradually takes over control of every aspect of your life. Today we'll be discussing the Belarusian prison system with OSW expert Kamil Kłosiński. And shortly after his release from that system, after serving 5 years as a political prisoner, the Polish-Belarusian journalist and deputy chair of the independent organization of the Polish minority in Belarus, Andrzej Poczobut. After the fall of the USSR, the Belarusian penal system inherited buildings, rules, and a structure. But that was not all. There was also perekovka. This is the Soviet concept of reforging a person, changing their character by isolation, labor, psychological pressure, and by a total subordination of the collective whole. In theory, a prisoner would leave the gulag as a better person, but the reality was much more straightforward. The prisoner should be forced into submission.
The Belarusian prison system has no overriding belief that crime can be totally eliminated. And so this term, perekovka, a radical change in one's personality where a persistent offender suddenly becomes a good, patriotic citizen, does not fully hold up. These transformations can take place in Belarus, but the Belarusian regime doesn't aim to transform everyone like that, like it was in the Soviet Union. There, criminal prisoners were specifically affected by perekovka. They were thought of as being very close to this good Soviet citizen who had simply experienced a difficult situation, and it was these external circumstances which made them commit these crimes. And they were convinced that if the circumstances changed, if they were worked on, then this person could become a classic peasant worker of the Soviet mold. The Belarusian government doesn't believe this.
Poczobut collected information for foreign organizations and also called for sanctions against Belarus and for the particular glorification of the Polish Home Army. Upon consideration of Andrzej Poczobut's case, he has received a prison sentence of 8 years in a maximum security colony. Andrzej Poczobut was sent to the criminal colony number 1 in Navapolatsk. Most Belarus prisons have an informal hierarchy of prisoners. At the top, there are the so-called blyatnois, meaning prisoners from the criminal underworld. They follow the prison traditions and the unwritten rules. The biggest group are the mujiks, who are normal prisoners who just want to serve their time and return to their normal lives. At the very bottom are the petuks, prisoners who are excluded from the prison society. This group involves those convicted of sexual crimes and also those who, in the eyes of their fellow inmates, have broken the rules of prison life. And although this division is informal, many prisoners feel that it's more important than the rules imposed by the administration.
There's a hierarchy which determines who's on the bottom of the pile, which makes this structure powerful. They have this instrument, they can push someone to the bottom, turn him into someone who can't sit down at the same table as the other prisoners and so on. In Navapolatsk, the administration took on this task. Although I didn't hear it myself, one of the political prisoners told me that when the prisoners were brought together to do corrective work, an operations officer said straight out, "We are the ones who decide who's on the bottom, not you. You don't have that right."
In the gulag, everything starts with a quarantine. Newly arrived prisoners are sent to a separate barracks, where for the first few days they are under constant observation. How do they respond to orders? Do they ask questions? Do they try to rebel? Are they trying to make contact with others? The administration analyzes everyone. This is not a normal intake procedure. It's a selection process. Every gulag has prisoners who, in practice, help the administration control fellow inmates. In prison slang, they're called goats. They are the ones observing, gathering information, and making character profiles. They inform the guards about the mood and the conversations of the prisoners. This means the administration knows much more than they appear to. The most effective system of control doesn't depend solely on the guards, but is based on prisoners keeping each other in line. And in these conditions, trust becomes a much sought-after resource.
When I arrived at the prison in Navapolatsk, there was a convict who'd sexually assaulted a 6-year-old girl, and he was getting on fine. Later, he became a leading capo in the hospital. In normal conditions, this kind of person would have been in real trouble. But there, he was in a privileged position. It was obvious he was cooperating with the administration and so on. And in general, we need to say that in Navapolatsk, many of those cooperating with the administration have committed sexual crimes. In other camps, they'd have it very tough. These capos, I know they're called goats in their slang, but I call them capo. I would look at them and think, come on man, are you a prisoner here, or do you think you're already a guard? One of these capos was talking about us in the administration. It's an interesting phenomenon from the psychological point of view, in general about how useful people are and how they survive in extreme conditions. I know one story from when I was in solitary confinement. One of these capos who was cooperating with the administration ended up in my cell because of a fight. It was like this. A young political prisoner arrived and this capo, feeling in a privileged position, started to manhandle him, push him around, and it came to blows. This capo wasn't ashamed to tell me about it, and I listened out of curiosity to find out how these people think. And he went to the administration and told them he'd had a problem. The officers had a roll call. Of course, they found something on that young political and they were about to hold him responsible, but they didn't manage to do it during the roll call. The young political smacked him in the face a few times. He fell down and then the young guy kicked him, and the political was locked up, and even though he was young, he just said what he thought. I'm going alone. He should also go. According to the rules the Navapolatsk administration promotes, both sides are punished when there's a fight. The administration thought the capo was acting properly. He denounced his fellow inmate, who reacted, and he was later beaten up by a fellow prisoner. He admitted to what he'd done and got 20 days in solitary confinement. 10 and then a further 10. This shows that the element of educational work is also applied to a capo. I'm sitting with this prisoner who says all this in front of a prison guard, as if he'll understand his grievance. But this guard just says, well, but you admitted your guilt, so what do you expect? I later asked the prisoner, why did you plead guilty? For them, you're squeaky clean, so why did you do it? And he says, listen, if I hadn't owned up to it, it would have been worse. I'd have got more days. And like this, I get less days. And I say to him, but you're their man. You're close to them, and that's how they treat you? He said that's just the way it is, and he kept cooperating with the administration with no reluctance. He didn't draw any conclusions about whether he'd been treated dishonorably. And that's their mentality. Of course, it's someone convicted for rape.
On paper, a prisoner has rights. He can see his family, receive packages, talk on the phone, buy things he needs. It's true that there are prison regulations written somewhere. There are the appropriate acts, rulings about rulings. It's a highly bureaucratic country. But I think the old, bad Soviet saying remains in force. A lack of precision in the regulations, or a contradiction, means they can be enforced more leniently. It's an old Soviet way of doing things. This opens up opportunities for citizens who can take advantage of legal loopholes, and it means there are situations, such as at work, where you can get away with some things. But it can also harm citizens, and it certainly harms political prisoners. Well, all prisoners. There are many things in the regulations, the right to have visits, letters, food parcels, various recreational benefits. But they are highly discretionary, and they depend on the approach of the administration, on a given prisoner's status, on the approach the prisoner has to the administration, or on how the administration interprets the prisoner's approach. Do they think he's compliant or a troublemaker who needs to be destroyed on instructions received from above? So all these rights, from 0 to 100%, depend on the situation. It's a simple mechanism. First comes the decision that a given prisoner needs to be punished. They can find an excuse for it later. Perhaps his charger was put away wrong, or he used the wrong tone of voice or greeted someone incorrectly. Every detail can be a good tool of pressure, and this means a prisoner cannot be sure if he's going to be punished the next day or not.
Przychodzi naczelnik na apelu do celi i mówi, źle posprzątane. Gdzie? No вот здесь, tu źle posprzątane.
The head came to inspect the cell and says, it's not been tidied well. I ask where, and he says, there. Next time tidy it better. And I'm punished 10 or 15 days. When the next time comes, It's a mess. 90% of my punishments were totally made up, and so I never admitted my guilt when they made it up. But if it was a real accusation, it was different. For example, they held me for a long time in isolation, and they took other cells to the yard behind my wall, and I'd ask them who's there and so on. We'd start a conversation, and then a guard would come over and ask if I was talking. And my tactic, my behavior in these situations was to not lie. If I'd been talking, then I'd tell them, yes, I was talking. Just because you lie non-stop, it doesn't mean I have to lie too. I decided I would tell the truth. Yes, I was talking to someone. I don't know who with. I heard a voice. I'm sitting there and I hear voices. That made them laugh. There was another case. It was cold, but the radiators were still on, so I slept next to it instead of on my bunk. There's a camera in every cell, so they showed me the image, that it was a violation and that they have made a decision on the punishment. I think I'd been a few days in solitary and I thought they were going to extend my stay. The door opens and he says that I have to provide an explanation. Well, I was very happy to provide an explanation. They'd already decided to throw me into the PKT, meaning I'd get a blanket and a pillow for the night. But I'd have to admit my guilt first. And I said, hang on. What guilt? Sleeping by the radiator? I won't deny that, but I'll explain why. It's not normal that I want to sleep there instead of on my bunk. I'll simply explain that it was horribly cold in my cell. The guard saw that I wanted to question this, write an explanation, so he waved his hand and closed the cell. And later it turned out that they didn't even give it to me. They didn't want an explanation because I'd never refused to write an explanation. I always took advantage of that. Most of the inmates just refused to write it, and then the administration would fill in a form that he'd refused. It was very convenient for them, because when you write down your opinion that there was a violation, they have to present some evidence and so on. But if the prisoner refuses, they just write up the report. So in general, they didn't like me writing an explanation. They preferred it when we just admitted our guilt and we'd get a smaller punishment then.
The government claims the prisons are not repressive. They are an opportunity for wrongdoers to change and to return to society. At least that's how they're presented on state television.
I'm a prisoner, someone who broke the law. There's no division into politicals and non-politicals here. Just breaking the law and serving your time for it.
This penal colony in Szklau is not the only one. It would be hard to call the prisoners' buildings a barracks. There's a hall there. There's food in the fridges. There's a shop, a football field, a golf course, a medical treatment point. They do dental work here. There's a sports hall and a pool table where they can organize birthdays. It's hard to imagine this because the stereotypes are totally different. What's the point in these colonies? First, everything depends on how you serve your sentence. But it is a penitentiary. Morning wake-up calls, checks, work, the usual things. Second, there's a resocialization system. All this was made by the prisoners themselves. If you live in good conditions, then when you get out, you won't want to commit crimes anymore. You could call it resocialization by way of rewards. But if you choose to break the colony's rules, you'll be in trouble. One of the most effective methods is not violence, it's humiliation. The administration has for years used the prison hierarchy against the prisoners themselves.
Są wykorzystywane tradycje więzienne przeciwko.
They use prison traditions against the prisoners. For example, every barracks has a shared toilet. Officially, there's a timetable with the name of who has to clean it and when. But in fact, only those at the bottom of the hierarchy clean the toilet. So if you do clean it, then you drop to the bottom of the prison hierarchy. And the administration know this. They know the timetable is a fiction, that only certain people actually clean the toilet. So if they want to punish someone, they'll carry out a toilet inspection. They switch on the camera and say, please start cleaning the toilet. And if someone starts cleaning, he falls down the prison hierarchy and he'll have problems. But if he refuses, then it's a violation of the regime and he can be sentenced. I was processed for that 4 times. The last time I heard that they would use Article 411 of the Penal Code, meaning they were extending my sentence by 2 years. You can't do that. They switch off the camera and I have 6 months in the PKT.
PKT. 6 miesięcy.
The worst place in the gulag is the Shizo PKT, a prison within a prison, for those prisoners who refuse to toe the line. The prisoners call it white hell.
Ja byłem w karcerze bez przerwy, faktycznie z
I was in solitary practically non-stop from the end of February to mid-May. This was the longest period when they extended it, in 2024. The hardest time was between the seasons when they switched off the heating. Formally speaking, it was springtime, but the building is cold. Before they switch off the radiators, you can heat yourself up by it. Some of us slept by the radiator. I did it. I remember the first time I experienced what they call miège saison in slang, when you stand near the radiator and you can feel it's getting colder and colder, until it's so cold you can't heat yourself up by it. It was a difficult period, and I think, oh God, how can I cope with it? And it lasted so long. It was still cold in June, because Navapolatsk is in the north of Belarus, and the weather there is even colder than in Grodno. And they use different methods to make it even colder. They know full well how the cells are laid out, what the individual cells are like. For example, number 11 was opposite the main entrance, and when they put someone in there and opened the main doors, there would be a draft from the open cell window. I spent 2 years with an open window. Sometimes you could hang a towel over it, but sometimes they made you take it down. And once, in 2025, when I wasn't in that cell, I was in number 2, where I spent most of my time. They took me out and I could feel that draft. It was minus 20 outside, and I felt that draft and thought, so, someone's in number 11 and they want to torture him.
The Belarusian prison system isn't trying to create a new man. Not even the functionaries believe that's possible. The real purpose is different. Fear. The prisoner needs to understand that the state can take everything he has: his dignity, health, peace of mind, sleep, even his sense of being in control of his own life. But there's one thing they can't take so easily: your memory. That's why the testimony of people such as Andrzej Poczobut are so inconvenient for the regime. They don't show the image of the system from propaganda. They show how the state of terror truly works.
The aim depends on the type of prisoner. If we're talking about someone in prison for corruption, maybe a business person who fiddled their taxes, remember what I said about vague legislation being open to interpretation? So, for these economic crimes, the system might just want to force payment out of them. This practice has been going on for decades. Business people involved in a scandal are forced to hand their company over to someone linked to the government, someone who wants to take over the reins, or they need to pay some money. And let's put it like this: not all of that money will end up in the public purse. But if we're talking about normal prisoners, not counting murderers, rapists, and other violent criminals, of course, so these normal criminals need to serve their time because they were harmful for society to one degree or another. And the majority of prisoners in Belarus have to work, practically for free. It should be useful for the economy or for someone linked to the prison system or law enforcement. Currently, I'm working at a post that produces toilet paper. There are local business people linked to the government, those loyal to the government, who the local government provides free labor for. There are many examples of this. For example, the oligarch Alyaksandr Lukashenka, who's linked to Alyaksandr Lukashenka and his circle. The media has repeatedly claimed he uses prisoner labor. He has a free workforce. These prisoners are supposed to do their time and work while they're doing it.
You can't say the prisoners don't have anything to do. There are over 1,000 women in the colony at present, and practically 100% of them are employed. They are still chiefly working as seamstresses, and uniforms and work clothes are created by the hands of convicts. In the women's part of the colony, they bake bread, and by the way, it's very tasty. Totally natural, no GMO ingredients, no preservatives, and no artificial coloring.
This concerns those who've committed serious crimes, repeat criminals. And we know about this from the political prisoners who served time and saw how often they are treated brutally in those prisons in order to break them, to discourage them from committing further crimes. They also take advantage of them to inform on their fellow prisoners because they know they're in the most difficult situation. They take different approaches depending on the person and on the situation. With repeat offenders, the treatment is hard and most often is simply about breaking killing them, crushing them, so they're not a danger to society anymore, which makes sense. But the methods they use are very inhumane, far from what's seen in civilized countries. This can be discussed, of course, but quite simply they are put under different kinds of pressure. And finally, there are the political prisoners, who we are most interested in. They are subjected to particular humiliations. It's probably only been written up informally, as I've never seen anything formal, but it's a scheme of humiliations, particular difficulties. They have the least rights, the least amount of privileges, for example, to meet their relatives, access to healthcare, parcels, letters, passes. These are rare cases. These are prisoners who need to be particularly broken to stop them from being a threat to society. Belarus has a semi-totalitarian or maybe a completely totalitarian government, and I suspect they don't view rapists and murderers as the greatest threat. This is based partly on my discussions with former prisoners. No, it's the politicals who are probably the biggest threat. They receive different kinds of bad treatment. It's usually not physical. They don't beat these prisoners, and this was confirmed by Andrzej Poczobut's treatment. I asked Andrzej about that repeatedly, and he said he was never beaten, and he said it in other interviews too. You don't need to directly strike a prisoner with a stick, with your fist, or anything else in order to humiliate him and inflict pain on him. It's enough to make his prison conditions difficult, to cut him off from the outside world, and to limit his contact to propaganda. They experience different kinds of psychological humiliation and are kept apart from other people, or they put strange people into their cells, provocateurs or the mentally ill, or people with physical illnesses, such as tuberculosis. And these are difficult conditions: poor food, no medication, no heating, or overheating during the August heat waves. The prisoner can't escape them, so there are different methods. They count on some of the prisoners being so broken that they won't return to politics, that they won't want to be involved in any sort of social or political activity once they're released. This was the view taken from Andrzej's interviews and in the article he wrote for our centre about the concept of perekovka, reforging a new person. And these are deeply rooted traditions of the Soviet gulag. You'll know them if you've read, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago or Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma Tales. And if you haven't read them, I would urge you to do so. It's not light reading by any means, but they delve into how it used to be, and, unfortunately, how it still is in Russia and Belarus. We had contacts with the Poles. They were asking for their Poczobuts. For me, he's a spy. That's why he was arrested. They say, hand him over. We tell them, okay, but there are a couple of our people over there. Send them back. We'll have an exchange. They also have families and so on. Intelligence was everywhere. It still is, and it will continue. I accept that and respect it. Okay, let's have an exchange. You want Poczobut. We can agree to that too. There's a Belarusian foundation, Vyasna, which means springtime, which is interested in human rights. It was co-founded by the legendary human rights defender Ales Bielatsky, who is also its director. He was also released recently, last December. This foundation constantly updates a list of political prisoners. It tries to identify them all and keeps a quite detailed count. But there is a margin of error because this is Belarus, and in this tragic Belarusian reality, not everyone will agree to being labelled a political prisoner. Some of the families of prisoners are afraid, and this means we have so-called hidden or undisclosed political prisoners who are serving their sentences for some social or political activity, real or imagined, and yet they are not counted in this ranking. So we can only assume that there are more political prisoners than Vyasna has counted. On the 1st of June, there were precisely 854 political prisoners on their list. I never exchanged anyone for anyone. It was an American offer. That's their politics. Transactions. You give me something, and I'll give you something in return. We can do it like that if you want. When the Americans spoke to me about the exchanges, I think they mentioned 1,200 people. Then they were saying 1,300 and 1,400. I said, what's the real number? Do you want 5,000? Let's take the 1,200 you were talking about and double it, or more. Get them out of here. But they answered, no, we don't need so many. So if anyone is enthusiastic about how the Americans negotiated a reduction of 500 prisoners since June last year, then they need to remember that the regime is adding new prisoners. That's the logic of this bloody semi-totalitarian regime, and this number is rising systematically. There hasn't been a release since March. The American talks have run into difficulties, and so we should expect the number to reach 900 or even 1,000 very soon. This is simply the logic, the mechanism of a regime which needs blood, which needs victims.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this film, try one you can see on screen. And please consider subscribing.